Does all this pageantry really mean anything? That was the challenge Colonel Mason Briggs threw out in the middle of Wellington Barracks. Parade ground. But Sergeant Thomas Reed didn't respond with anger or even words. He remained calm, composed, and silent. What followed made one thing crystal clear. When it comes to honor, tradition speaks louder than rank. Want to see how a British guard taught an American officer a lesson without uttering a single word? Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Wellington Barracks like a shroud, and through it emerged a figure that would soon learn one of the hardest lessons of his military career. Colonel Mason Briggs stepped out of the black embassy car, his American uniform crisp against the gray London dawn, combat ribbons gleaming on his chest like medals of pride. He had come to observe the famous changing of the guard ceremony, but what he carried with him was something far more dangerous than curiosity. It was contempt. Briggs had spent 23 years in the United States Army, rising through the ranks with the kind of aggressive efficiency that made enemies of peers and subordinates alike. His file read like a textbook of military competence: logistics operations in Germany, staff positions in the Pentagon, a brief stint in Iraq managing supply chains. But for all his achievements, Mason Briggs had never truly understood what it meant to be a soldier. He measured worth in efficiency reports and budget allocations, not in the quiet dignity of men who had stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. As he approached the parade ground, his eyes fell upon the Coldstream Guards standing at attention in their iconic red tunics and towering buckskin hats. To Briggs, they looked like relics from a bygone era, playing dress-up in a world that had moved beyond such theatrical displays. He didn't see the steel beneath the ceremony, the blood that had consecrated those uniforms, or the tradition that bound these men to something greater than themselves. At the center of the formation stood Sergeant Thomas Reed, a man whose very presence seemed to anchor the morning itself. Reed was 34 years old, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard-won experience and quiet authority. His buckskin hat sat perfectly aligned, casting a shadow over eyes that had seen more than most men twice his age. There was something in his bearing, a stillness that wasn't mere discipline, but something deeper, more fundamental. Reed's journey to this moment had begun years earlier in the dust and heat of Helmand Province, Afghanistan. He had been a young corporal then, part of a rifle company that had walked into hell and somehow walked back out. The memories still visited him in the quiet hours before dawn, the weight of his wounded mate draped across his shoulders, the crack of sniper fire echoing off compound walls. The moment when he realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The transition from combat soldier to ceremonial guard hadn't been easy. Many people, including some in his own family, had questioned why he would trade the real soldiering of Afghanistan for what they saw as parade ground pageantry. But Reed understood something they didn't: the ceremonies, the traditions, the precise movements that tourists photographed and social media mocked. These weren't just for show. They were a living memorial to every man who had worn the uniform and paid the ultimate price for it. The Coldstream Guards weren't just soldiers. They were the keepers of a flame that had burned continuously since 1650. Every perfectly executed drill movement, every immaculate uniform, every hour spent standing motionless in the London rain, was a tribute to the men who had died at Waterloo, at the Somme, at Dunkirk. Reed carried their names in his memory like a prayer, and he would not let anyone dishonor their sacrifice. Briggs, however, saw none of this as he strode across the parade ground with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his own assumptions. He had come to London as part of a joint military liaison program, meant to strengthen ties between American and British forces. But somewhere along the way, his mission had become personal. He had grown tired of what he saw as European pretension, sick of ceremonies that seemed to serve no practical purpose in an age of modern warfare. The confrontation began innocuously enough. Briggs approached the guard formation during a brief break in the morning preparation, his footsteps echoing against the ancient stones. The younger guardsmen tensed slightly at his approach, but Reed remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the American officer's shoulder. "Quite a show you boys put on," Briggs said, his voice carrying the particular brand of condescension that Americans sometimes deployed when they wanted to remind the world who had won the last war. "All this fuss for what amounts to a damn costume party. You people really think standing around in funny hats makes you soldiers?" The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between knights. Round them, the other guardsmen went very still, their breathing controlled and their eyes fixed forward. They had heard variations of this speech before from tourists, from their own families, from politicians who saw military ceremony as an expensive anachronism. But there was something in Briggs's tone that went beyond mere ignorance. This was deliberate disrespect, and it would not go unanswered. Reed's response came without hesitation, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from having earned respect, rather than demanded it. With respect, sir, these funny hats have stood on battlefields you've only read about. The words landed like a physical blow. Briggs's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the recognition that he had underestimated his opponent. But his pride was too strong to allow retreat, and his next words would seal his fate. Big words for a man who spends his days playing dress-up, Briggs sneered, beginning to circle Reed like a predator sizing up its prey. Bet you couldn't last 5 minutes in real training. This was the moment that would define everything that followed. Reed's eyes flicked to Briggs's chest, taking in the ribbons and decorations that told the story of a career spent largely behind desks and in conference rooms. The Bronze Star was there, earned during a brief deployment to Iraq, but Reed could read the details in the way it sat among the administrative awards. This was not a man who had led from the front, who had shared the dangers he asked others to face. Your file says you commanded a logistics battalion in Germany, sir, Reed said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the parade ground. If you'd like a lesson in real soldiering, I'd be happy to arrange it. The words fell into the morning air like stones into still water, sending ripples of tension to the assembled guardsmen. Several of them sucked in sharp breaths, recognizing that the game had suddenly changed. This was no longer a casual exchange between officers of different nations. This was a challenge issued by a professional soldier to a man who had questioned not just his competence but his honor. Briggs's face darkened, the flush of anger creeping up his neck. In his 23 years of service, no one had ever questioned his courage so directly, so publicly. His first instinct was to assert his rank, to remind this British sergeant exactly who was addressing whom. But something in Reed's bearing, in the absolute stillness of his posture, gave him pause. There was no bravado here, no theatrical posturing. This was a man who had made a simple statement of fact and was prepared to back it up. You think you're some kind of hard man because you wear a costume and march around for tourists, Briggs shot back, his voice rising slightly. I've been soldiering since before you were out of diapers. Son. Reed's expression never changed, but those who knew him well might have caught the slight tightening around his eyes. With respect, sir, soldiering isn't about the years you've served. It's about what you've done with them. The challenge hung between them like a sword waiting to fall. Round the parade ground, other members of the regiment had begun to take notice. Word spread quickly through the ranks. The American colonel had questioned their honor, and Sergeant Reed had answered. This was about more than personal pride now. It was about the reputation of the regiment, the dignity of the crown, and the memory of every man who had worn the uniform and paid the price for it. Briggs found himself trapped by his own words. To back down now would be to admit that he had been wrong, that his assessment of these soldiers had been based on ignorance rather than understanding. But to accept the challenge would mean stepping into a world where his rank and nationality would offer no protection, where he would be judged solely on his ability to perform as a soldier. Fine, he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. Set it up. But don't expect me to go easy on you because you're used to playing games for the cameras. Reed nodded once, a simple gesture that somehow managed to convey both respect and absolute confidence. I'll arrange something appropriate for tomorrow morning, sir. I think you'll find it educational. As Briggs stalked away, several of the younger guardsmen exchanged glances. They had heard stories about Reed's service in Afghanistan, whispered accounts of actions that had earned him decorations he never wore and respect he never demanded. But they had never seen him in action, never witnessed the transformation that occurred when the ceremonial soldier became the combat veteran. That evening, as word of the challenge spread through the barracks, the betting pools began. The smart money was on Reed, but there were those who pointed out that Briggs was still an American officer, still a product of what many considered the world's most professional military. The stakes were higher than mere personal pride. This was about the reputation of the guards, about proving that tradition and modernity could coexist, that ceremony and combat effectiveness were not mutually exclusive. Reed spent the evening planning the next day's activities with the methodical precision that had served him well in Afghanistan. He wasn't interested in humiliating Briggs. Embarrassing a foreign officer would serve no one's interests, but he was determined to teach the man a lesson about the nature of true professionalism, about the difference between command and leadership, between position and authority. The training course Reed designed was drawn from the regiment's standard combat preparation program, the same regiment that had prepared them for deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. It began with a 5-mile run in full kit, followed by weapons handling, tactical movement, and close-quarters combat training. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that any competent soldier shouldn't be able to handle. But it would test more than physical fitness. It would reveal character. Meanwhile, Briggs spent the night in his hotel room, second-guessing his decision to accept the challenge. He had maintained his physical fitness, of course, but his last real field exercise had been years ago. Most of his recent training had been conducted in air-conditioned classrooms and comfortable conference rooms. Still, his pride would not allow him to withdraw. He had questioned these soldiers' competence publicly, and now he would have to prove his own. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with a fine mist that made the training area slick and treacherous. Reed arrived early, dressed in combat fatigues that bore the subtle marks of hard use. His equipment was clean but well worn, the gear of a soldier who had learned to trust his life to his kit. Briggs appeared precisely on time, his uniform crisp and new, his equipment clearly issued from stores rather than earned through experience. The first test was the run 5 miles through the training area, carrying full combat load. Reed set a steady pace, not the punishing sprint that Hollywood might have depicted, but the measured cadence of a soldier who understood that endurance was more important than speed. Behind him, Briggs struggled to maintain the pace, his breathing already labored after the first mile. "You set quite a pace, Sergeant," Briggs managed between gasps, trying to maintain some semblance of authority. Even as his physical limitations became apparent, Reed's response was delivered without breaking stride or showing any sign of exertion. "This is the pace my men maintained in Afghanistan, sir, sometimes for 12 hours at a time." The words struck home like a physical blow. Briggs had read the reports from Afghanistan, had seen the statistics and casualty figures, but he had never truly understood what they meant in human terms. The idea that these soldiers he had dismissed as parade ground performers, had maintained this level of intensity under combat conditions was a revelation that shook his preconceptions to their core. By the 3rd mile, Briggs was struggling seriously. His breath came in ragged gasps, and sweat poured down his face despite the cool morning air. Reed, by contrast, seemed barely affected by the effort. His breathing was steady, his pace unchanged, his attention focused not on his own discomfort, but on the training objectives ahead. "Sir," Reed said quietly, "would you like to rest for a moment?" The offer was made without condescension, without triumph. It was the simple courtesy of one professional to another, the recognition that pushing beyond one's limits served no constructive purpose. But to Briggs, it felt like salt in a wound that was already deep enough. "I'm fine," Briggs gasped, though it was clear to anyone watching that he was anything but fine. His face had taken on an unhealthy shade of red, and his movements were becoming increasingly labored. Reed recognized the signs. He had seen them before in Afghanistan, when new rivals tried to prove themselves by ignoring their physical limitations. "With respect, sir, there's no shame in recognizing your limits," Reed said, his voice carrying the authority of experience. Better to train smart than to train injured. But Briggs was beyond reason now, driven by a combination of pride, embarrassment, and the growing realization that he had seriously underestimated his opponent. He pushed on, his form deteriorating with each step, his breathing becoming more labored with each passing minute. The weapons handling portion of the training revealed even more significant gaps. In Briggs's practical experience, while he could field strip an M for carbine competently enough, his movements lacked the fluid efficiency that came from repetitive practice under stress. Reed's demonstrations were studies in economy of motion, every movement precise and purposeful, the result of thousands of hours of practice and real-world application. In Afghanistan, Reed explained as he demonstrated proper magazine changes, "We learned that speed is less important than smoothness. A rushed reload that results in a malfunction can get you killed. Better to take the extra second to do it right." Briggs nodded, trying to apply the lesson, but his hands shook slightly from fatigue and his timing was off. The contrast between his theoretical knowledge and Reed's practical expertise was becoming more apparent. With each exercise, The tactical movement exercise was where Briggs's limitations became most apparent. Reed led him through a series of bounds and rushes, the kind of fire and movement tactics that had kept British soldiers alive in the killing fields of Helmand Province. What looked simple in training manuals proved devastatingly difficult in practice, requiring not just physical fitness, but the kind of tactical awareness that could only be developed through experience. "Sir," Reed said after Briggs had failed to properly time his movement with covering fire, "in combat, hesitation kills. You have to trust your training, trust your equipment, and trust the men around you." The words carried weight beyond their immediate tactical application. Briggs was beginning to understand that what he had dismissed as ceremonial posturing was actually the visible expression of a much deeper military culture. The precision of the parade ground, the attention to detail in dress and deportment, the unwavering adherence to protocol, these weren't empty rituals, but the foundation of a fighting force that had earned its reputation through blood and sacrifice. The close-quarters combat training was perhaps the most humbling experience of all. Reed's movements were economical and brutal, the product of training that had been tested under fire. His techniques weren't the flashy martial arts of Hollywood movies, but the practical, efficient methods that had been developed through centuries of warfare and refined through modern combat experience. "The goal isn't to look impressive," Reed explained as he demonstrated a disarming technique. "The goal is to go home alive. Everything else is secondary." By the end of the morning session, Briggs was exhausted, humbled, and forced to confront the reality of his own limitations. He had maintained his physical fitness, but fitness was only one component of soldier competence. The gap between his theoretical knowledge and Reed's practical experience was vast and undeniable. As they walked back toward the barracks, Reed spoke quietly, his tone carrying none of the triumph that might have been expected from a man who had just proven his point so decisively. "Sir, if I may say so, you're not a bad soldier. You've maintained your fitness, you know your doctrine, and you've got the will to see things through. But soldiering isn't just about individual competence. It's about being part of something larger than yourself." The words stung because they were delivered without malice, without the satisfaction of victory. Reed was simply stating facts, offering perspective from a position of earned authority. Briggs found himself nodding, too exhausted and too humbled to maintain his earlier antagonism. "Those ceremonies you saw yesterday," Reed continued, "they're not just about tradition. They're about remembering that we're part of a chain that stretches back centuries. Every man who wears this uniform is connected to every man who wore it before him. When we stand at attention, we're not just following orders, we're honoring the memory of men who died so that we could have the privilege of serving." The lesson was sinking in, but it would take time for Briggs to fully process its implications. The idea that ceremony and combat effectiveness were not opposites, but complementary aspects of the same military culture was foreign to his American sensibilities. He had been raised in a military tradition that prized innovation over tradition, efficiency over ritual, results over process. A week later, Briggs found himself standing among the spectators at the Queen's birthday parade, watching as the Coldstream Guards performed their ceremonial duties with the same precision they had demonstrated in training, but now he saw it differently. Each movement was executed with the discipline of men who had proven themselves under fire. Each uniform was worn with the pride of soldiers who had earned the right to represent their nation and their regiment. Reed led the formation with the same quiet authority he had displayed during their training session. His movements were economical and precise, his bearing dignified without being pretentious. As the band played "God Save the King," his eyes swept the crowd and briefly met Briggs's. For the first time since their initial encounter, the American officer didn't look away. That evening, alone in his hotel room, Briggs sat quietly polishing his boots with a care and attention he hadn't shown in years. Beside his American flag pin, he had placed a small Union jackknot as a symbol of surrender, but as a reminder of the lesson he had learned. Discipline wasn't about being loud or aggressive or demanding respect. It was about earning it through consistent performance, day after day, year after year, until it became as natural as breathing. The experience had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. He had come to London expecting to observe quaint British military traditions, but instead he had encountered a fighting force that combined the best of ancient traditions with modern military effectiveness. The lesson wasn't that Americans were inferior to the British, but that both nations had something to learn from each other. Reed's final words echoed in his mind as he prepared for sleep. "Discipline isn't loud, sir. It's constant. The truth of that statement would follow Mason Briggs for the rest of his military career, shaping the way he led his soldiers and the way he understood the true meaning of service.